I wanted to talk today just a little bit about your vision for what you want to do. I know that everyone is going to be thinking about all the great technologies. You just heard a fantastic couple of talks about using different technologies and how you can integrate them and really make some terrific outcomes. But what I'm going to say before you do that, I think that it would be helpful to start with a vision. And I'll explain that in just a minute. Because I think the vision is your foundation. That's what creates the building blocks for you to be able to create something really good and really lasting. So for example, what I would say is don't think about what you're going to use just yet. Just think about the question, why? Why do you want to use solar panels? Or why do you want to use a wind turbine? Think back first about what you're trying to create and why it's important and what the overall objective is. So I'll talk about that in just a second. But first, let me start off with just a little story. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and my grandparents. They grew up in the East Coast of the United States in a state called South Carolina, a little town called King Street. It's a very sleepy little town, very few people lived there. It was a farming community, very swampy, hard to make a living there. My grandparents did not have a lot of money, but they were very happy. They had a good family. They had 2 children. One was my father. They didn't have electricity. And my father, as he was growing up, he told me that every Saturday night, what he would do as part of their routine was they would drag a large tub into the living room and put it next to the fire, and they would heat up the water, and he would have to take a bath once a week, if he needed it or not, and that was how he took a bath, so he hated Saturday nights. But the interesting thing about the way that they lived, though, was they lived in something called a boarding house. Now, this is fairly common in that area. There was not a lot of money. They worked hard. They didn't have a lot of money. So they lived in one house, but it was shared by about 4 other families. And the families worked very closely together. There's one person who owned the house, and everyone else lived there. Now, they weren't just renters in the house. They were people who actually were part of the house itself. So, for example, if the roof had a leak, and those roofs always were leaking, then everyone in the house, even the renters, would climb up on the roof and they would fix them. And where would they get the materials? Well, they would take the cans that they bought soup in, and they would take a hammer and they would bang it out and they would flatten it, and then they would climb up on the roof and they would fix the hole. And when they lived that way, you realize there was no such thing as trash. There was no such thing as trash. Because everything that you use could be reused at some point. You could fix the roof with it, or you could feed the farm animals with it, or you could grind it up and put it in the garden, and it would become the compost for the next. So they had no concept of trash. There was nothing to throw away. There was no trash company to come pick something up anyway. So that was something that was very important. The ability for them to work together was also a key component of that society. And I think that that's something that I've also taken away, that the connection between people and the ability, regardless of how much money you have, makes a big difference in whether or not you're happy or not, and whether or not you can thrive. They also, at that time, made the best use of the natural resources. So if you see a picture of the old boarding house, it had trees on the southern side of it. And that was intentional because they knew that if you plant a tree on the south side in the summertime, which is very hot, just like here in Hong Kong, the tree will shade the house and keep it cool. No one had air conditioning. And in the wintertime, when you want a little bit more sunshine, the leaves fall down and the sun can come in and warm up the house. But in order to have that, it means you have to plan ahead. You have to plant a tree that you know will take a long time. From a sustainability point of view, planting a tree is probably the most sustainable thing you can do, because you never plant a tree for yourself. You're always planting a tree for someone 20 or 30 years from now. So from my point of view, I really took something from that, and I thought that looking back on those simple ideas that my grandparents had really gave me an idea about what sustainability means, and I think that is something that we can use today as we continue forward and think about how do we make things sustainable. So I have 4 general principles that I intend to use that I think encapsulate what sustainability means. And it goes back to the way that we used to all live 100 years or so ago. So the first thing is that sustainability is really about human beings. It's about us first. There's environmental implications. We all talk about greening. But if you look at a building, the things that we do inside the building and make it green usually have to do with making it healthy. You know, we want to reduce VOCs and contaminants. We want to have good airflow. And we want to have light, and so the sunlight can come in. Those are all things that make us happier and healthier. So keep in mind that when we try to address pollution and other kinds of unsustainable practices, it's really because those are the things that can make us survive and thrive. So a sustainable world is one where people are enriched by their surroundings. So that's number 1. Number 2, everything is a part of the system. And I think this is an important thing to consider. I remember one of the first projects I worked on many years ago, and there was a question about what kind of flooring we should put inside of a building. Well, there was one type of flooring that was not very sustainable, but it was very cheap. And there was another one that was a little bit more durable, and it was a little bit more environmentally friendly, but it was more expensive. And if you just look at it from that side, then you would say, well, if you want to be cost effective, you should have to buy the cheaper one. You know, even though it's not as environmentally friendly, but you really do have to think about the cost. Well, if you think about the system, then you realize that a floor is not just the cost. It's also about the maintenance. It's about how often you have to clean it. It means, do you have to ever strip it down and put a new coat of varnish on? Well, it turns out that the cheaper floor needed a lot more maintenance than the more environmentally friendly floor. So if you looked at over 10 years, you found that the one that was a little more expensive today was much, much a better deal, environmentally and financially, because now we're looking at the entire system. The third thing is, and this comes back to my recollection of my grandparents, that waste, the principle is waste. When I say waste equals failure. So we can have a lot of conversations about whether or not trash should go into a landfill, or into an incinerator, or we should bury it, or something else. But once you're talking about that, we've already failed. We haven't found a good way to reuse resources that are at our disposal. And if you go into nature, you don't find trash cans in nature, right? Because everything is reused. When a tree falls down, it becomes the food for the other organisms. So that's my third principle: waste equals failure. So let's eliminate waste. And then finally, sustainability really focuses on the future. We just talked about planting a tree. A tree is probably the most sustainable thing you can do. So you're really sacrificing your actions today to benefit somebody tomorrow. In fact, I heard an old saying, I think it's a Chinese saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but the saying was that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. And the second best time to plant a tree is today. I think that makes a lot of sense. But think about the future. It's easy to talk about the future, but it's hard to plan for the future. So think about this. Let's go back to my grandparents. My grandmother was born in 1901, so essentially the beginning of the century. And when she was born, there was no way that you could lift yourself off the ground. There was no airplanes, no helicopters, nothing like that. Well, by the time she was 2 or 3 years old, the Wright Brothers in North Carolina had built this contraption that could fly. It only flew for about 30 seconds, but it could fly. It was the first time that somebody had ever been successful in getting off the ground and staying off the ground for an amount of time. By the time my grandmother was in her 20s, that machine that only got off the ground for 30 seconds had evolved to the point where it was able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Charles Lindbergh, in the late 1920s, was able to fly across the ocean all by himself. By the time my grandmother was in her 40s, that airplane had evolved so much that it could go faster than the speed of sound. Actually, a supersonic airplane. And by the time my grandmother had retired, and when she was in her 60s, that technology had evolved so much that we were able to put a person in a capsule and fly them all the way to the moon and back. Now think about that. That's one person's lifetime. That's one generation. This is a woman who was born with no concept of flying, and she died knowing that you could fly around the Earth and land on the moon and come back. Think about what kind of changes took place in one person's lifetime. So how do you think about that from a sustainability point of view? When you're trying to anticipate what your challenges will be 10 years from now or 20 years from now, things happen so fast. 20 years ago, hardly anybody was even using email. Now I can't even imagine life without it. So what's 20 years from now going to be? And how do we prepare for it? Well, I think that the 4 sustainability principles help us at least try to think. Because we can't necessarily anticipate the future, but we can accept the fact that that things change quickly and unpredictably and rapidly, and we can at least accept the fact that we should be not making decisions today that are going to make it harder for us to be successful in the future. So, with that in mind, let me fast forward to something that might be a little bit more relevant for all of you. Let me tell you about a case study. And let me put that into the context of these 4 principles. So about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, the city of Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada, was applying for the privilege of hosting the Winter Olympics, 2010 Winter Olympics. We have the Winter Olympics going on right now, so this is a bit relevant. Well, Vancouver was successful, and they were awarded the contract, and of course everyone was very happy. So they had to think about what to do. Well, of course, lots of people had ideas. But the city of Vancouver had decided that they were going to call themselves the greenest city in the world. Very easy to say that, but it's not always easy to be that. You can call yourself anything. You can call yourself the smartest person on the planet, but at some point you have to prove it. Well, Vancouver decided that the Winter Olympics was their ability to prove this. So they thought, how are we going to create the Olympic Village? This is where all the athletes are going to come. How can we create that and really start to integrate some of these sustainability principles so that we can use this not only as a place for the athletes to live, but also as a place where we can showcase some good creative thinking about how we design sustainable communities. So the first thing they did was they looked for a space that was underutilized. So if you start with the idea that waste is a failure, that if you had that means that if you have any area that is abandoned or old factory buildings that are no longer used, that means that we failed. Right? It's not just an opportunity, it's a failure. So they went to a place that was an old factory, an industrial site, it was right on the water. They decided that would be the place. Now, before they got started with thinking about, hey, what kind of buildings should we have, and what kind of solar panels should we put on, and should we have wind turbines, they started by creating a vision. You have to start thinking about what exactly do you want your outcome to be, and then you can build the technologies to meet that. So they knew that, first of all, you can't just build an Olympic Village. That Olympic Village will be good for about 3 weeks, and then everyone's going to go, and then what do you do? So the first principle of sustainability is, focus on the future. And so they already had started to think about the fact that if we're going to put all this time and investment into this village, it has to be something that lasts over the long term. So that's the first principle. The second principle is sustainability revolves around human beings. So before they started thinking about technologies or greening or anything else, they started to think about what exactly do we want for the people who are going to be there? What kind of families do we want to be there? And what's the most important thing to make families happy? So if you can't have a sustainable community if people are not thriving, and if they're not healthy. So what is it that is going to take place that can make this happen? So they decided they wanted to have mixed use. They wanted to have some low-income housing mixed in with some affordable housing with purchased properties. They thought that that's very important. They knew that they wanted to make it very friendly to children. That was one of their top priorities. So if you want to make it, if you want to make a community conducive to children, then that means there's other things that you have to do. It means that you have to have schools and playgrounds and parks, but it also means other things too. It made them think about how to deal with traffic, because if you want to have a lot of children running around, then you don't want to have a lot of cars coming back and forth. You don't want to have big trucks dropping off their supplies. So it influenced everything from the schools to the parks to the traffic patterns and to how the people can come and go. They also felt like it was important to make sure that everyone had an ability to appreciate nature. So if you have a chance to look at the designs, you'll see that the buildings that are closest to the water are the shortest buildings. And the further away from the water, the buildings get taller and taller. So no matter where you are, you're always going to be able to enjoy the scenery and the nature and a beautiful view. They also realized that waste is failure. And waste is not just trash, but waste means anything that we're wasting. And so from a greening perspective, that means energy as well. There's no value in using any more energy than you really need. In this building right now, we need to have electricity for the lights, and for the microphone, for the computer. And ideally, we would like to use only the amount of energy that's needed to be able to create that service for us. Any more energy than that is wasting, and there's no value in this. There's no value in using more water than we really need. So they use that as part of their goals as well. And they also understood the idea that sustainability means looking at the infrastructure and looking at how the system works. So for example, they took a look at how the waste system was, all of the sewage that comes out of houses. And they realized that all of the sewage that comes out of houses is coming out at a constant temperature, like the geothermal is here. They realized that if all of that waste that we're calling waste, if it's all coming out at the same temperature, then why can't we utilize that temperature for a district heating and cooling system? You can create something. Now, it seems a little disgusting to think about, but the waste that comes out of a house is actually something that's now being used to heat and cool in a very efficient way in the living village. But you wouldn't think about waste and energy in the same context unless you embrace the idea that everything is interconnected. So the result was, by focusing on the outcomes, the broad general outcomes, they were able to create what at that point was the only development in the world that had been able to gain all 83 points in the LEED system. It was the most environmentally friendly building complex in the world. I think it might still be that. The only one that's ever hit 83 points. So I think that if you ever want a little bit of inspiration, I think to go back to the Vancouver living village, I think might be a good place to start. But I would also say that if you are working on your project and you're coming up with new ideas, and if you're thinking about what you might want to do, if you get stuck, if you get a little frustrated, you're looking at wind turbines and it just doesn't work in this, then take a step back and go back to what your vision is. What is it exactly that you want to accomplish on a big scale, and then see if the technologies you're choosing are helping you to accomplish that. So in other words, don't fall in love with any one particular type of technology. Fall in love with what you want to accomplish, and then let the technologies help you. Well, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this process. I really look forward to seeing your outcomes, and good luck for everybody.